The moment of rupture arrives not with spectacle, but with procedure. An emergency court order is, by design, an admission that normal timelines have failed, that an action has moved faster than the law can comfortably absorb. When such an order hits a sitting president, it signals that the judiciary has concluded the risk of inaction outweighs the deference typically afforded to executive authority. This is not a political rebuke dressed up as law. It is a legal alarm bell. In this case, the rupture is defined by loss of control rather than loss of office. Control in modern American governance rests on momentum, the ability to act first, frame the narrative, and force institutions to react. An emergency court order reverses that flow. It freezes motion, imposes external judgment, and transfers initiative from the executive to the judiciary in a matter of hours, sometimes minutes. The presidency remains intact, but its velocity is abruptly halted. What makes this moment consequential is not merely the content of the ruling, but its timing and urgency. Emergency orders are rare precisely because courts are cautious about intervening midstream. When they do, it reflects a judgment that constitutional boundaries, statutory limits, or irreparable harm are at stake. The law is not debating policy wisdom. It is asserting jurisdiction over power that has moved too far, too fast. This rupture also exposes a deeper tension within the American system. The presidency projects singular authority, but it operates inside a lattice of constraints that only become visible when stressed. The court order forces those constraints into public view. What appeared as unilateral control is revealed as conditional power, contingent on legal tolerance. The breaking moment, then, is not chaos, it is clarity. The system has spoken abruptly and formally, reminding all actors that control in American governance is never absolute, only provisional. When power meets the judiciary, it does so on terrain that is deliberately uneven. The executive moves with speed, discretion, and political urgency. The courts move with deliberation, precedent, and an institutional memory that stretches far beyond any single administration. An emergency court order collapses that distance. It forces these two modes of authority into direct confrontation, not as equals, but as counterweights. The judiciary does not compete with the presidency for popular legitimacy. It does not claim a mandate from voters or assert policy vision. Its authority rests instead on restraint, the capacity to say no precisely because it so often chooses not to. When a court intervenes on an emergency basis, it is exercising the most disruptive form of that restraint. It is declaring that executive action has crossed from the realm of discretion into the realm of legal jeopardy. This collision reveals a common misjudgment about presidential power. The executive branch often assumes that speed creates facts and that facts eventually harden into acceptance. Courts are designed to interrupt that logic. Injunctions, temporary restraining orders, and emergency stays exist to prevent momentum from becoming legitimacy. They are tools of pause, not reversal, yet that pause can be devastating to claims of control. What follows is rarely a clean institutional handoff. The executive may argue necessity, national interest, or irreparable harm of its own. The judiciary responds not by disputing intent, but by narrowing authority. It asks whether the law permits the action, whether proper procedures were followed, and whether constitutional lines were crossed. These are not abstract questions, they are mechanisms through which power is disciplined. At this stage, the loss of control becomes visible. The executive must now justify itself within a framework it does not command. Legal arguments replace political messaging. Timelines are dictated by briefs and hearings rather than press cycles. The president remains the most powerful individual in the system, but no longer the most decisive actor in the moment. This is the judiciary's quiet strength. It does not seize power, it absorbs it. And when it does, it reminds the country that authority in the American system is not about dominance, but about survival within limits. The idea of executive control in the American system is often misunderstood as command rather than coordination. From the outside, the presidency appears omnipotent. Executive orders are signed, agencies are directed, crises are addressed with declarative certainty. Yet that appearance masks a more fragile reality. Presidential power is expansive, but it is not self-executing. It depends on law, compliance, and institutional consent. An emergency court order exposes this dependency with unusual clarity. What seemed like decisive action is suddenly contingent on judicial approval, bureaucratic interpretation, and procedural legitimacy. The executive cannot simply will an outcome into existence. Agencies hesitate, enforcement pauses, legal counsel recalibrates. The machinery of governance slows, not because the president has lost authority, but because authority must now be proven rather than presumed. This moment reveals a structural truth. Control is distributed, not centralized. Federal agencies operate under statutory mandates that cannot be overridden by rhetoric. Civil servants are bound by law, not loyalty. States possess independent authority that can resist or delay federal directives. Courts stand above all of it, not as overseers of policy, but as guardians of process. Executive control functions only when these parts move in alignment. Presidents often misjudge this ecosystem, particularly under pressure. Speed becomes a substitute for strategy. Announcements outpace legal review. Political confidence overrides procedural caution. When that happens, the system responds not with collapse, but with friction. The courts do not negate power, they reveal its contours by enforcing its boundaries. The loss of control, then, is not absolute. The president remains capable of influencing outcomes, shaping agendas, and mobilizing support. But the illusion of unilateral action dissolves. Power must now move through channels that impose delay, compromise, and justification. In this sense, the limits of executive control are not failures of leadership, they are features of constitutional design. They exist to ensure that no single actor governs by momentum alone. And when those limits assert themselves, they remind both leaders and citizens that American power is strongest not when it is fastest, but when it is restrained. Once an emergency court order lands, resistance no longer operates in the shadows. It becomes formal, documented, and procedural. Institutions that may have privately questioned executive action are now compelled to act openly, guided not by political calculation, but by legal obligation. What follows is not a single confrontation, but a cascade of responses across the system. Federal agencies, often portrayed as extensions of presidential will, reveal their true character at this stage. General counsels issue guidance, implementation pauses, career officials demand written clarification before proceeding. The executive branch begins to fragment internally, not out of disloyalty, but out of risk management. No agency wants to be found in contempt of court. Compliance becomes the default posture, even as appeals are prepared. At the same time, legal escalation accelerates. Emergency orders invite immediate countermoves. Stays are requested, appellate courts are engaged, and Supreme Court intervention is quietly contemplated. Each step shifts the battle further away from public messaging and deeper into legal terrain. The language of politics gives way to the language of precedent, standing, and jurisdiction. Control over the timeline slips even further from the executive's grasp. State governments and civil society actors often enter the frame here. Attorneys general file briefs, coalitions form. What began as a singular executive action now faces a multi-front institutional response. The presidency is no longer acting against abstract opposition, but against legally empowered entities with defined authority and procedural leverage. This phase exposes a central miscalculation of modern executive strategy, the assumption that resistance is primarily political. In reality, the most durable resistance in American governance is institutional. It does not rally crowds or dominate headlines. It files motions, enforces injunctions, and waits. And because it waits, it often wins. Legal escalation is not a sign of system failure. It is the system functioning under stress. Each filing, each ruling, each delay reasserts the principle that power must justify itself repeatedly, not just once. By the time the process stabilizes, the executive may still prevail, but it will do so narrowed, constrained, and permanently altered by the resistance it encountered. This is how control erodes in practice. Not through rebellion, but through procedure. Political power depends not only on authority, but on narrative coherence. Leaders govern more easily when their actions fit a story that feels controlled, intentional, and forward-moving. An emergency court order fractures that story. What follows is not merely legal difficulty, but narrative instability, a sudden loss of interpretive dominance. In the immediate aftermath, messaging becomes defensive. The executive attempts to reframe the intervention as overreach, obstruction, or partisanship. Yet courts do not speak in slogans, and that asymmetry matters. Judicial language is dry, technical, and indifferent to political emotion. Its very neutrality undermines attempts to turn legal restraint into political grievance. The narrative begins to slip, not because the president lacks a megaphone, but because the facts no longer bend to it. Media dynamics accelerate the collapse. Emergency rulings force journalists to shift from speculation to documentation. Timelines are scrutinized, legal texts are quoted, experts replace surrogates. The focus moves from intent to consequence, from promises to enforceability. Each headline anchored in procedural reality further erodes the original framing of control and decisiveness. Supporters may remain loyal, but uncertainty creeps in. Momentum stalls. Allies hesitate to align themselves with an action now under judicial scrutiny. Donors, lawmakers, and bureaucratic partners calculate risk. Political capital, once assumed to be renewable, begins to look finite. The president still commands attention, but attention no longer translates cleanly into leverage. What collapses here is not popularity, but inevitability. The sense that events are unfolding according to a single will is replaced by the visibility of constraint. The public witnesses something it rarely sees clearly. Power being argued with, slowed, and conditionally applied. This visibility matters. It reshapes expectations about what leaders can actually do. Narrative collapse does not end presidencies, but it alters them. Governing becomes harder when authority must constantly be explained rather than assumed. Every subsequent action is viewed through the lens of resistance already encountered. The story of control gives way to a story of contestation. In that shift, political fallout takes root not as outrage, but as doubt. And doubt is the most corrosive force a narrative of dominance can face. No emergency court order exists in isolation. Each one enters a long historical record of moments when executive ambition collided with judicial constraint. What gives the present episode its weight is not novelty, but repetition. The American system has seen this pattern before, and each time it reveals the same underlying truth. Power is tested most severely when leaders assume history will not apply to them. From Franklin Roosevelt's confrontations with the Supreme Court during the New Deal, to Harry Truman's failed seizure of the steel mills during the Korean War, to more recent injunctions against executive actions on immigration, national security, and emergency powers, the lesson has been consistent. Courts rarely challenge presidents lightly. When they do, it is because executive action has outpaced its legal foundation. The form changes, but the structure endures. Comparative cases sharpen this understanding. In each instance, presidents argued necessity, urgency, or exceptional circumstances. In each, courts responded by asking narrower questions. Where is the authority? What statute permits this? What limits were ignored? These cases are remembered not for their rhetoric, but for the boundaries they clarified. Truman lost not because his policy lacked support, but because it lacked authorization. Others prevailed only after retreating, revising, or seeking legislative backing. What distinguishes successful executives in these moments is not defiance, but adaptation. Those who treated judicial intervention as an existential threat often deepened the crisis. Those who absorbed the ruling and recalibrated preserved institutional credibility, even at political cost. History awards the latter, though rarely in real time. This comparative lens strips the present moment of its drama. What feels unprecedented is, in fact, familiar. Emergency court orders have always functioned as inflection points, forcing presidents to choose between escalation and accommodation. The system does not demand submission, it demands compliance with the process. Seen this way, the current rupture becomes part of a larger constitutional rhythm. Executive power expands, meets resistance, and is reshaped. The judiciary does not halt governance, it refines it through friction. And every time this happens, the record grows longer, making it harder for the next president to claim ignorance of the limits they are about to encounter. After the emergency passes and the headlines fade, what remains is not victory or defeat, but adjustment. Governance aftershock is quieter, more constrained, and more revealing than the moment of rupture itself. The presidency continues, but it does so altered by the knowledge that speed has consequences and that institutions remember. In this phase, Decision-making slows not because capacity is lost, but because caution is restored. Legal review becomes central again. Agencies demand clearer statutory grounding. Advisors who once prioritized political advantage now weigh institutional risk. The executive learns, often reluctantly, that control is exercised most effectively when it anticipates resistance rather than provoking it. The courts, having intervened, recede. Their power lies precisely in this withdrawal. They do not govern the aftermath. They set the boundary and step back, leaving the executive to operate within it. This withdrawal is often misread as weakness, but it is the opposite. The system is rebalanced, and balance does not announce itself. Public attention moves on, but the effects persist. Future initiatives are shaped by what just occurred. Language becomes more careful. Authority is framed more defensively. Even when similar goals are pursued, they are routed through safer channels, legislation, negotiated rulemaking, intergovernmental coordination. The shock produces institutional memory. What this reveals about American governance is neither heroic nor cynical. It is structural. Power here is not designed to be absolute, even in crisis. It is designed to survive through correction. Emergency court orders are not failures of leadership. They are tests of it. The real measure comes afterward in whether leaders adapt or repeat. Control, in the end, is not the ability to act without restraint. It is the ability to continue acting after restraint has been imposed. Presidents who understand this govern longer, more effectively, and with fewer ruptures. Those who do not mistake resistance for sabotage and process for obstruction. The system endures not because it prevents shocks, but because it absorbs them. And in that endurance lies the quiet resilience of governance itself.